Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cameron, and I am the co-chair of programs for IPAC Manitoba. I want to thank you all for taking the time today for joining IPAC Manitoba. IPAC Manitoba's first part in a three-part series on emergency management in Canada. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. Recognizing that you might be joining from other parts across Canada, I'd like to acknowledge the lands from which I join you today, which is Winnipeg, Manitoba. IPAC Manitoba is located on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Nawak, the Anishinawak, Dakota, and Dene, and the homeland of the Métis. We recognize the distinct histories of the 7 numbered treaties that apply to this land. We recognize that public administration and public policy have been used as tools of colonialism and the harm that this has caused Indigenous people. We are committed to promoting public administration in a way that advances reconciliation in a spirit of collaboration with Indigenous people and communities. So IPAC Manitoba is a recognized leader in research, training, knowledge sharing, and outreach, including hosting a large number of conferences and events held regionally and nationally. Our membership-based organization works with all levels of government to promote quality public services and practices. We are known for a role in engaging new and experienced public servants to expand their networks and advance excellence in every public sector organization in Manitoba and elsewhere. Today, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Johanu Botha, the Assistant Deputy Minister of Emergency Management for the Government of Manitoba. Dr. Johanu Botha holds one of the few PhDs in Canada that is specialized in Canadian emergency management. His background is focused on determining effective collaboration across all levels of government and the military during all phases of emergency management, and he has served as an officer in the Canadian Armed Forces during domestic disaster responses. His work on floods, wildfires, and hurricanes is one of the country's only multi-hazard, multi-province, large-scale disaster response dictatorial analyses, published in 2022 as a textbook for emergency managers, officials, soldiers, and scholars called Boots on the Ground, Disaster Response in Canada. Johanu took lead of the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization in 2019 to bring a strategic whole of government lens to emergency management with an extra focus on mitigation efforts that reduce disaster impacts over the long term. Some of the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization initiatives overseen by Johanu include a revamped disaster financial assistance program, launching a new mitigation and preparedness program, and successfully coordinating the government's response to multiple natural disasters, including the 2022 flood. Johanu has brought emergency management expertise and capacity to other large operations, including Manitoba's successful COVID-19 vaccination rollout and integrating displaced Ukrainians into the province. I want to welcome Johanu, and you can take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jasmine and IPAC, for that warm welcome. Before I keep going, I'll pause briefly to see if any of the IPAC folks on the line has identified any audio or visual issues. And if they don't flag anything in the next few seconds, then I'll continue on. Not hearing or seeing anything, I will continue on. If there are audio or visual issues that pop up, please send it in the chat or reach out to Jasmine, and then we'll see if we can adjust. So it's so nice to be here. Thank you to everyone for dialing in the middle of the day for many of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I won't introduce myself. It's just been done very generously by IPAC. The focus over the next 45 minutes or so is on emergency management in Canada. And I feel, and I hope that you will feel by the end of the 45 minutes that this is, it's no longer an esoteric, niche field of study that's just of mild interest. It is a growing and established policy area that, especially as we continue to learn lessons from the pandemic response and as we begin to fully internalize the growing frequency and impacts of hazards due to climate change, that this will become an even more important policy field. So thank you for dialing in and learning more. I'm certainly happy to be here. So let's delve in. Here's I hope my slides are working. I'm clicking along. So IPAC or someone please flag to me if it doesn't translate on the other side. But high level agenda for today. We'll talk about the what first. What are disaster events? What does that mean when we talk about disasters? If it's a big concept, it's a big word, but if everything is a disaster, then nothing is. So what's that definition? What is the definition of emergency management as an actual professional practice and as a policy? What does it truly entail? Because again, it can seem like a massive umbrella. Then we'll talk about the who populates this space, who is involved in emergency management policy and program delivery, and who are the partners that sort of fill out the rest of that ecosystem. And then really the bulk of the discussion will be about the how. It'll be about how do we get this done? How do we deal with disaster events in this policy space? And critically, how do we do it? How do we do it better?
Johanu, sorry, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Apparently we're having issues viewing your slides. I
Sure.
can see them fine. So just hoping maybe you can just maybe stop and restart and see if that helps. I'm not a tech, but maybe
Yeah,
that'll.
no problem at all. So you can see the slide that I'm on right now. It's the agenda
Yes.
slide.
Yeah, but some of our participants cannot.
Okay, I'll see if I flip back and forth, can you see that?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if it's just on their end or if it's on your end, but I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. So I think a lot of people can see it. I'm seeing a flurry of thumbs up on my screen.
Okay.
So
yeah, I can see that too. Yeah, I don't know how to solve this. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. The amount of thumbs ups that I'm seeing, I'm going to guess that the majority of participants can see. And this may be a technical issue on some users' parts. Luckily, I'll try to speak in a way that the slides are useful but not required. And if you keep hearing issues from multiple people on your end, Jasmine, then let me know and I can definitely try and sign back.
Right. Thank you, Anu.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Yeah, no. So I trust most of you can see the slides. We will move into the bulk of the presentation, as I was saying, will be about the how. How do we do this? And instead of going through the minutiae of multiple events and responses, I have selected two large events over the last year that Manitoba Emergency Management was the lead on, directly oversaw. I mean, I've best line of sight on these two. One is caused by a natural hazard, flooding across the province of Manitoba in 2022. And the other event was caused by a non-natural hazard. So the war in the Ukraine, which caused thousands of displaced Ukrainians, and leading to provinces like Manitoba utilizing their emergency management system to integrate Ukrainians into our society. And the reason I've selected these two is I think a dominant theme in the emergency management space is us being mandated to tackle many large events that transcend just natural disasters. And what does that look like? Finally, we'll talk about some lessons learned and then next steps. So I will delve right into it. Sorry for the wordiness on these first couple slides, but it does get a little less wordy as we move along. So disasters, what do we mean by that? It can't just be a bad thing happening, because there are many bad things that happen all the time that doesn't entail the emergency management system jumping in or responding. So the way that we sort of define it within the emergency management world, and this is reflected in sort of the policy best practice and legislation in this world, is disasters are non-routine emergencies that transcend a community's ability to function. So this means that it's distinct from, the kind of adverse event that would necessitate a 911 call. Emergency frontline services, police, fire, medical. There's established processes for these. Usually, a community and its programs and services can continue to function with numerous 911 calls ongoing. It's also separate from those large, massive type of events that is sort of on the societal destruction scale. So if we're talking about an asteroid strike, if we're talking about climate change itself, if we're talking about massive socioeconomic decline, those are things in which the emergency management space would certainly play a role, but it likely wouldn't be a main role, because those kind of phenomena entail all of society, all of government, and we would just have a piece of it. Where we really sort of play the key role is sort of in that in-between space: wildfires, floods, multi-vehicular accidents, pandemics before they reach a certain threshold. I've got examples coming up, but it's sort of in that in-between space that the emergency management system kicks in. And how is emergency management itself defined? Well, we try and prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate against those types of events. So it's phases, or it's a cycle, if you will, that sort of rotates around these type of events to really try and reduce their impact. You'll notice as we get into the who that there are many hazard specialists out there, so to speak, individuals and entities, and best practices and researchers who understand bad things really well. They know how earthquakes work and the impact of them. They understand how floods manifest, how wildfires spread. Public health physicians or epidemiologists will understand the spread of disease. Emergency management and emergency managers are not an expert in any of those hazards. We rely on them to help define the risk for us. Where we come in is the impact, because all those things impact various communities and various people in various ways, and trying to coordinate those impacts is really our bread and butter. Our authority does stem from legislation. So emergency management is not just a phrase or just a practice. It exists in legislation across this country at all levels of government. The most prominent and the most used piece of legislation is often at a provincial or territorial level. Every single PT in this country will have an emergency management act of some kind that has requirements often for local authorities and municipalities to be prepared in a certain way for these non-routine events. But they also come with a set of extraordinary legal powers. So if local levels of government require extra powers that they don't usually have in their legal toolkit, they can access this often through provincial legislation. Sometimes larger cities will have legislation of their own, and it often gives provincial governments an array of powers as well during a state of emergency. But the point at this point is just that legislation exists. There's an enabling authority for us to do our work. A lot of this legislation also comes with facilitating funds, disaster financial assistance funds, into communities. Before I leave the what, I'll just note that in the Canadian context, the emergency management capacity, especially the operational response capacity, is quite decentralized. And there are some constitutional, institutional reasons for this. The main reason is that the areas of government that's often most impacted by disasters, health, education, local governments, local authorities, municipalities, justice, they often all, or to a large degree, fall under provincial jurisdiction. So that means that even though emergency management is shared across all levels of government, the big players are often at the provincial level, which makes us quite different from our American counterparts when you see an emergency management organization at the federal level in the US FEMA respond to an event on the front line. There's no counterpart to that in the Canadian context. So it's a fairly decentralized affair overall, but the federal government certainly plays a role, as we'll see. So that's the what. Those are the type of events that we deal with, and that is the practice that we employ. Here's some of the examples of the kind of events that we deal with, that we prepare for, that we respond to, that we try to mitigate from happening in the first place. This is a very, very small snapshot of the kind of events that we deal with. If you want to go to the Canadian Disaster Research Database, you'll find, hundreds more. And if you ever sort of go to a provincial level and then delve into each province's municipal level events, you'll see many more as well. These are ones that I've either been personally involved in through researching and interviewing the leaders, or have personally overseen by virtue of my role as the Chief Emergency Management Official in the province of Manitoba. So that's the ones I've provided, but they reflect that definition of non-routine emergencies. They're not 911 calls by any stretch. You need multiple organizations to deal with them, but they are not this cataclysmic, catastrophic event either. The overall, the existing institutions should be able to deal with them, although there is there are gaps to fill, as we'll see. Let's move into the who, and I do promise my slides get less wordy and and more fun later on. This is just as we sort of get our feet wet in this space. Who are the players in the emergency management world? Who fills this policy space? As you'll see on the top half of this slide, in the Canadian context at this time, it's a fairly governmental affair. It's fairly heavy on government. Every level of government will have a political individual who is accountable for the emergency management capacity of their jurisdiction. For local authorities like municipalities or counties, this is almost always the mayor or the reeve that is responsible. And they will have at the officials level, at the public servant level, an EM lead and a team. Large cities in the country will have, tens to 100 plus individuals supporting this kind of work. But then in rural municipalities or a small municipality in the country, you might have a single person doing this work off the side of their desk. There's emergency management is partly defined by the massive gaps in capacity you will see between small and large jurisdictions. Indigenous governments, of course, are essential to effective emergency management and are often responsible with, depending on the context, support from Indigenous Services Canada for emergency management of their community. The chief is often the political representative accountable first and foremost, but then depending on the size of the government or the community, there will be a fairly robust EM lead or team, but with the same diversity of capacity that we see in other local governments, or in local governments rather. I've bolded provinces there for the reason that I've mentioned before, for better or for worse, and there's definitely debate around how to adjust this current institutional framework that we find ourselves in. But provinces, again, especially compared to other federal countries like the US or Australia, have the most EM capacity in this country from an operational and response perspective. Unlike the local governments, there's always a minister identified as being responsible for emergency management. This is very often the same minister that's responsible for justice or municipal affairs or public safety. In the Manitoba context, given our history with flooding, the minister responsible for transportation and infrastructure is most often the minister responsible for emergency management. And then what you have within that minister's department is the EMO, is the Emergency Management Organization. That's the organization that I oversee in the Manitoba context. And what makes this fairly unique is that this EMO at the provincial level is what would largely be recognized by other jurisdictions and other countries as an established EMO entity that deals with emergency events under the EM framework, meaning that it's responsible for all phases of emergency management, preparation, recovery, response, and mitigation, and it can stand up a fairly robust emergency operations center to coordinate all aspects of a response within a province. The federal government does not have such an EMO as such. As we've talked about before, there isn't a FEMA in the Canadian context. However, public safety does play a key role in supporting emergency management across the country. There is a federal minister responsible for EM. The Public Safety Canada, through its EM capacity, provides funding for recovery and mitigation. There's a government operations center that does try and provide situational awareness across the country. But outside of deploying, the Canadian Armed Forces or other more specialized teams under certain circumstances, the bulk of the EM capacity that you'll see, especially during large events or during responses, will be the province and local authorities. So those are the individuals and the players and the actors that are in Canada legislatively mandated to implement EM. Just below there, I've noted some of the other partners involved that you will often see, especially during the response phase when the EM world becomes more public. You've got the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, critical service providers, so utilities and telecoms, the Red Crosses and Salvation Armies of the world, of course. And I've noted some extra EM partners that have become more and more prominent, especially during the pandemic when the medical industry was heavily involved. You'll see engineering industry quite involved in large floods. So the ecosystem grows around the government players during large events. And I've noticed civil society at the very bottom there, and we'll see this in the next steps as well. One thing that the Canadian context has not perhaps done as well as other places in the world is incorporating capacity within community organizations, informal and informal, on how to most effectively prepare and respond to events. So that's sort of a bit of an outstanding question on how we can do better with that. So that's largely the who. What I've provided here real quick is you've heard me talk already about the impact specialists and the hazard specialists, which is sounds very academic and conceptual. So I'm trying to make it a little more practical here. And these are the hazard specialists, so to speak, and the impact specialists, so to speak, at the provincial level during a flood. But there's ways in which you can translate this to the local level and to the federal level, and for other hazards as well. In a nutshell, what we mean by hazard specialists is, those entities and folks who have become experts in dealing with the bad thing happening. So in the flood context in Manitoba, we've got fairly sophisticated engineering and technical services that will forecast the flood and the risk. The pandemic equivalent here would be epidemiologists and public health doctors. There's bridge and water infrastructure engineering folks to ensure the infrastructure is understood if it becomes vulnerable or can be fixed. There's mapping of floodplains. And there's the operation of water control structures to actually move the flow of water around. These are all hyper specialized entities and individuals that no emergency manager, regular emergency manager can pretend to be doing this stuff. Similar on transportation operations, folks who are clearing highways, managing highways. There's often, I think, for those outside of the EM world, they'll see the sort of the EMO on the back of vests, and they'll assume this is what the EM folks are doing. Very rarely. EMO folks are often at the center, in an emergency operations center, in a town hall, at the legislator, doing the coordination work. If they're on the ground fighting the bad thing, then things have probably gotten really, really bad. It's a bit of a frustration amongst those in the emergency management space when big blockbuster disaster movies has the FEMA vehicles, all on the front lines, dealing with whether it's an asteroid or a zombie apocalypse, because there will be experts that will have to know how to deal with that, and very rarely will be the emergency manager, who will be more on the back end. Which takes me to the definition of the emergency management organization in a flood, but this will apply to other hazards as well. It's the coordinating body that links the flood response to each impacted area. So including other provincial departments that might be affected, health, families, so on, local governments, so they have awareness of what all the hazard specialists are doing, or incorporating their own hazard specialists like public work folks at a municipal level into the provincial capacity. The relevant non-government organizations that are being impacted or asked to deal with impacts, the Red Cross during evacuations, for example, the public generally, to ensure they have the right information, and to federal support if that's needed. And of course, the EMO is collating all the activity and the response to provide the minister and ultimately government with a picture of the response. So you can plug different hazards in here. You can have the wildfire service into the hazard specialist if you're dealing with a wildfire, where you have experts identifying plumes of smoke, the direction of the fire, the size of the fire. You certainly have experts on the ground dealing with the fire. So the hazard specialist will change depending on the hazard, but what the impact specialist does, the emergency management side of the world, won't change. We will continue to coordinate identifying the impacted players and trying to provide a coordinated approach to all the impacts. And you'll have a version of this emergency management capacity at the municipal level, certainly with the mayor, Reeve, and their EM team, usually within a town hall or an ad hoc municipal emergency operations center. And you'll have a version of this at the federal government as well. So this kind of distinction between these two, I think, is important to understand our space. I've just provided a snapshot of what this could look like for decision-making during a response. The key takeaway point here is that the ministers that are involved by an event, the deputy ministers that are involved by an event, and the specialists dealing with the event, they all might change depending on the event. But the EMO and the emergency management system, the impact specialists, if you will will remain the same as an all hazards entity. And of course, in the provincial context, the minister responsible for EM will remain the same as well. I've provided just another snapshot of this. It's all small and blurry, so don't worry about the detail there. This is an example of a more detailed response organization structure where you've got the EMO side on the left, and you've got the flood fighting team on your right in blue. And the main point here is that the details within that blue will switch up depending on the hazard, whereas the EM world will remain steady regardless of the hazard. So that's at a very high level, the what we do and then who's involved. But I think, and I hope what will help make this clearer is working through an actual event and talking about the who and what that way. So the first event that I've selected is last year's widespread flooding across Manitoba, and let's go through the event and its response actions and try and tease out the who, what, and certainly how of emergency management. So come March, our preparedness phase is complete. Remember that emergency management is not just response. Ideally, there are phases to it, and you've completed your preparedness or your planning for a particular hazard by the time the response phase shows up. So ideally by March, we've planned, we've met with all our government partners, with all our local authorities, with First Nation communities via Indigenous Services Canada, other federal partners. Everyone's met, everyone's identified roles and responsibilities, thresholds, communication procedures, meeting schedules, templates are ready, etc. That should be done. Then what we got is our hazard specialists. The Hydrological Forecasting Center provided an outlook in Manitoba, indicating there was a risk of moderate to major flooding in most southern Manitoba basins. So if this was a wildfire, then the Manitoba Wildfire Service would be able, with Environment Canada, would be able to give us some predictive modeling. If this was a disease spread, and this would come from our epidemiologists, but this is a flood, so we're getting it from the Hydrological Forecasting Center. And we are seeing some impacts in the Red River Valley. For those not dialing in, not from Manitoba, that's a valley sort of south central in the province south of Winnipeg. And for those also not from Manitoba, a flood outlook saying this is not a big deal. In Manitoba, it's kind of our bread and butter. It's kind of what you would expect. So it seemed like perhaps business as usual. Come April, we've now got spring runoff, so the snow's starting to melt. And this requires us to start operating our large water control structures. So in the Manitoba context, we've got the main ones as noted there, the Red River Floodway and the Portage Diversion. In a nutshell, from a layperson's perspective, it allows us to manage the flow of water to different areas to avoid flooding in communities. Another good example, like the forecasting center of the hazard specialists at work, not the emergency managers operating these water control structures. Pumping has begun locally. So we often talk about the initial impacts always being felt locally. All disasters are local. Pumping has commenced by local authorities, municipalities. But then the big change happened for us. The middle of your screen there, you'll see that we had multiple Colorado low weather events. These are events that comes up from the States, and it just dumps a ton of precipitation right into Manitoba. And it ended up being between 8 and 15 of these that came sort of on the weekends. So the Manitobans in this space did not have much of any weekends throughout the summer. But as the weather events are dumping upon an already saturated system, we saw these water levels rise and communities starting to flood. As you'll note there, by the end of April, we had 9 municipalities declare states of local emergency. So we talked about the legislation at the beginning of the presentation. When municipalities and most provinces, this is the case, when they declare a state of local emergency, they essentially gain some of the powers at the provincial emergency management legal level for their community. So there's an array of things they can now do that they wouldn't be able to do during regular times. Things like accessing private property to protect their community from extra flooding. We started to see evacuations then as well. The story just continues for the rest of this flood season. Usually, if I was providing an after-action review on flooding in Manitoba, hopefully it would end in end of May or early June. But because of the continuous precipitation that was piling into an already very, very wet jurisdiction, across essentially all of Manitoba, we just kept flooding. Evacuations continued. We had 37 states of local emergency by the end of May, 38 by the end of June, 45 by the end of the summer, and the last one lapsed in October 27th. So that's a whole summer's worth of flooding. As different water regions, watersheds and rivers started to sort of go into regular levels, so the communities had access again, evacuees could return home. That's when our large lakes in the middle of the province started to flood, and the communities around those lakes then were in full-blown response mode. So very, very busy season. And as you can see, we talked about the WHO, heavy involvement from local authorities and their communities to protect themselves, to evacuate, to identify what to do next, and a very heavy involvement from the hazard specialists at the provincial level, the water control folks, the forecasting folks, and EMO essentially tying all the links together to make sure everyone knew what everyone else was doing. Just a snapshot of the level of communication that we try and maintain throughout our response. I won't go into detail here. You've got just the EMO side and the forecasting side. And then just to give everyone kind of a sense on the kind of resources that need to be deployed during an event like this. And this gives you, I think, a nice idea of the interaction between the provincial level, EMO, and the local authority level, and including Indigenous communities through Indigenous Services Canada. We often sit or have access to a lot of resources in the province that many local authorities do not have access to. So via the EMO's Emergency Operations Center, there's a logistics section that has clean lines of communication to municipalities, local authorities, and they can request resources. There needs to be a case made for them. If there's a threshold hit, we can then deploy them out. And we deploy thousands of pieces of different flood fighting equipment over the last year. What you'll note throughout all this is that the federal government wasn't a massive player in any of this, given how decentralized emergency management is. Also, given that floods is something that we're fairly used to in Manitoba. As we saw during the pandemic, there is much more federal support in communities in two provinces, given the scope and the relative novelty of that hazard. All the communities that were under a state of local emergency, essentially half of Manitoba, all of the southern bit, as well as the First Nations who had declared states of local emergency. And key now, before we jump onto the Ukrainian response piece quickly, is recovery. So emergency management is not just bells and whistles and sirens and the response phase and everything that comes with that. There's a whole program area within almost every provincial emergency management agency, and certainly larger municipalities as well, that now has to focus on coordinating the recovery efforts. And in the Manitoba context, for last year, this is going to be massive and a multi-year recovery effort to take care of all the damaged infrastructure and other pieces and other damages that occurred. I'll give you some actual stats. So over 100 municipal applications, over 6,000 damaged provincial sites, and then individuals and families and small businesses and farms are impacted as well. In many cases, there isn't insurance for this kind of event. So the EMO of the world, because recovery is a part of our mandate, would oversee and provide disaster financial assistance to these groups. These are often very large programs. There's a federal cost share component. Many EMOs essentially run a mini insurance firm, if you will, to be able to get these kind of dollars out to municipalities and communities and individuals so that they can recover from an event. It's a massive part of what we do. Not always the most salient, not always the most reported on, but a big part of what we do. And of course, we don't want to just recover. We don't want to just build things back to the same condition that was damaged in the first place. So you'll see many jurisdictions, including our own, are attempting to build in mitigation programs into our recovery so that municipalities, local authorities, nonprofits, farms, they're able to access funding to build things back or plan for things in a way that reduces the impact of the hazard in the first place. So we've talked a big game on mitigation in the emergency management world for a couple of decades now, but we're really starting to see some programming develop around mitigation. So this is a small example of what we're doing there. So let's talk about an another event entirely before we move over to lessons learned and next steps. No natural hazard here. There's no flood. There's no wildfire. No earthquake. No tornado. There is a war across the world that is far outside the mandate or the scope of any certainly provincial emergency management organization, but there's nevertheless an impact. And even though we're not the hazard specialists in this case, the hazard specialists, are Ukrainians fighting the war, but we're dealing with an impact, and the impact that we're dealing with are thousands of Ukrainians that are coming to Canada. Canada opened its doors to displaced Ukrainians, in Manitoba, like most provinces, opened its doors as well. It became very clear early on, at least in the Manitoba context, given the amount of displaced Ukrainians that would select Manitoba as home, given how large the Manitoba existing Ukrainian community and population is, it became clear this would be a massive operation, and the kind of tools and logistics approaches and planning that you would usually see maybe in a silo-wise department and program area, maybe like a conventional settlement program at a provincial level, wouldn't suffice for this kind of event. This was similar to the impacts of a disaster, in that if this amount of individuals just arrived into a community without the emergency management sort of program wrapped around it, that community's ability to deal with it may be overwhelmed. Hence, emergency management organizations, especially in Manitoba, was tasked to help deal with this, really applying an evacuation model. So, when you evacuate large numbers of people, hundreds, thousands of people, best practice is ideally for them to arrive at a one-stop shop where they can find all the services that they need in one area. They don't have to go and identify various channels in, there is no wrong door. And then a big part of evacuation best practice is repatriation, to be able to get individuals back into their homes. In the case of displaced Ukrainians, their homes would now be here. So how do we ensure that they're able to move through the initial welcoming in and into permanent housing, a workplace, or some kind of other support if needed? So we apply the emergency management approach to this. It's worked fairly well. As you can see there, we've got an example of sort of a one-stop shop on how we've built things in Manitoba. Individuals arrive at the airport, and then everything they need, everything from meals and temporary accommodations, health cards, social insurance numbers, access to employment, childcare services, is all accessible in one area from where they can go. So the emergency management evacuation approach was applied to this event, even though it wasn't a natural hazard. And the stats bear out its success, at least in the Manitoba context. So using federal data, Manitoba has brought more Ukrainians in than any other province. So roughly 12% of all displaced Ukrainians have come to this province, which is far more than our share of the population. And we've got some stats there on what has worked well applying this kind of approach. So not as nearly as many slides as on the flood side, but I think demonstrates how the EM world can be asked to tackle impacts that are not related just to natural hazards. And that's a question that I think the emergency management community is asking itself as we go into the future. Where does our scope end? Where should we expand our scope? Where do we need to constrain it? So the final section here, thank you for your patience. I think I'll be able to still leave about 10 minutes for questions, is I've sort of shown how we do things, but what are lessons to learn? Where can we improve? What are the things that we're doing well or should continue to do well in this fairly unique policy space? So I'll beg for your patience here. I started off with a culinary metaphor, and it sort of ran away with me. So just take it with a grain of salt. I sort of asked the question, given everything we've learned over the last few years in the events that the EM world has dealt with, what ingredients would go into a successful emergency management? And this is what I came up with. So first off, like any good menu, you'll have sweet selection of appetizers. And the nice thing about appetizers is if the rest of the meal goes bad, if the appetizers were really good, then maybe you'll still have a good memory of the meal. And they're really bare essentials. I think in the EM world, if you don't do these things, if we haven't done these things, we tend to run into problems. You will see this in almost every after action review. So I'll go through them briefly, each one at a time. Information sharing and communication is something that we're always finding we're lacking, and we're always trying to improve. Here's some concrete things that we do in the EM field, but we can do more of, and we need to watch when it doesn't occur. So distribution of emergency response plans to all partners, allowing different partners, different perspectives, different stakeholders, different partners into an emergency operations center so they can have a presence at the decision-making table, maintaining communication throughout the response. There's no point providing a flood forecast or a wildfire forecast or a COVID-19 wave prediction one time and letting it go. You need to communicate throughout. Distributing new data as the event unfolds is key. And then something that I think we can struggle with that we need to work on is being honest about an organization's strengths and weaknesses, identifying to partners in our space and even to the public about things that we're not good at, things that we are struggling with, things that we need more perspectives on to get good at. It's only good for disaster response if your colleagues know where you're vulnerable. So that's a key part of information sharing that can be tough to do, but we're learning how to do it. I've got an example there of having field staff and communities and how useful that is to share information back and forth. As I keep going, I should note that you're not hearing me say much about the public in general. And that is because very often the link to the public are often hazard specialists that are on the ground dealing with the bad thing happening, or they're often local authorities who are much closer to their residents. The services and programs of certainly a provincial level emergency management organization is very much tailored to other organizations in our ecosystem, whether they're the hazard specialists, whether they're other levels of government. And so something that we need to think about for the future is how does emergency management as a system in Canada provide better direct services to the public writ large in terms of individual or family level preparedness. Maybe individual and family level programming where there's generators or non-perishable foods. Those are questions we need to ask for ourselves, because emergency management in Canada is very, at least at a provincial level and federal level, our clients are other organizations, rarely the public. So just that caveat aside, flexibility is essential to being effective in this space. You will not do well in responding to bad things happening if you aren't willing to change your mind. An example here is the province in the Manitoba context often waits until after an event to declare disaster financial assistance to communities. It was very clear to us that there's value in doing that early on, so there isn't a stress about whether or not there'll be support down the line. We were able to pivot midway and make that declaration during a response. So that kind of flexibility was very useful to partners. Support is key. If you can't support each other, it's very difficult to be in this space. In fact, one way of thinking about emergency management is building up support for other people when bad things happen. So if you can't do that, you will struggle. There's lots of ways to support: technological through the Hydrological Forecasting Center, boots on the ground, actual human beings, funds, data intelligence. This is something we need to do. If we can't do it, we struggle. And then this one is difficult. This one could be a challenge, is acknowledging at the front end that when you're planning for bad things happening or during a disaster response, there's going to be disagreement on how to do it and how to do it well. So having a dedicated forum, even built into your emergency operations center, that includes representatives from the right levels to work through an issue before it simmers is what I would call an appetizer, something key to do in the menu of emergency management. Moving on to the entrees. So the meatier meals, if you will, in the EM space. These are key concepts in emergency management. You've probably heard about them before, effective coordination, integration, high levels of trust, but what do they mean in practice? In practice, if the provincial level, local authorities, our EM partners, whether they be, the utilities of the world, the Red Cross Salvation Armies of the world, you need to have a common vision of the end state. Where do we want to get to? How do we get there together? Is there an agreement on how to get there? We might not agree on everything, but at least on the key response actions, do we know what we need to get to our end state? Is there an appreciation that collaboration is more effective than going our own way? Are we trying to consult each other before taking an action so that, if we deploy in a whole bunch of sandbags into a community, they're not aware, that they're not surprised? If we're going to change the water control structure and there might be impacts on flooding communities, are they aware of that happening ahead of time? This is really a very fancy way of saying, does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? And we need to be able to do that. In the Canadian context, while there's always coordination gaps we need to fix, my sense is there's a growing trend in wanting to collaborate as opposed to the belief that one key organization can dictate for all what to do. I think that old school way of thinking in emergency management is thankfully starting to be phased out. Integration is sort of a step up from coordination. It's not just the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing. It's them actually working together in a coordinated fashion to tackle a project or a disaster response as one team. This can be difficult. It may not always be necessary, but at some point, for some events, having the province and individuals from local authorities, the NGOs of the world, all integrated into one system as one organism, if you will, can be very important. The example I've noted here is as a digital common operating platform that we're rolling out in the Manitoba context, whereby everyone involved in response can get live situational awareness and populate the response actions into one single place. So we're all integrated in what we do. And then trust seems maybe like a little bit of a fluffy concept, but everything breaks down where there isn't trust. So we need to be able to trust each other. We need to be able to be vulnerable with each other. The way we measure that is a willingness to work with each other, again, by doing preparedness workshops with everyone in the space, by hosting seminars where we're very honest about our forecasting with everyone. This comes with some risk. If you share information in government, it comes with risk, but we need to be able to share that to build trust, because when trust breaks down in the EM world, you can't respond effectively. And I'll go through this relatively quick to give some time for questions. I know I'm running out of time. I sort of thank everyone for their patience, but I do want to identify some dishes to avoid, which might be true outside of the emergency management space, but it's certainly very true in our world. I've listed them there. So I think, especially for many folks who've dialed in and are part of large bureaucracies or organizations, it'd be naive to think that something like empire building doesn't happen. So in the emergency management world, instead of pretending like it doesn't happen, we rather try to be very alive to the fact that there might be incentives in large bureaucracies that can cause this, and we don't want it. We want to be alive to if it does occur, and we want to avoid doing this. A definition of empire building in our world would be withholding information, resources, actions that could benefit an overall response. Get out of this response quicker so we can start recovering. Withholding that so we can enhance sort of the prestige or the power or the time to shine of one organization. This is a big no-no. There's something probably a bit human about this. So we have to be alive that it can occur, but we want to avoid this happening. That this doesn't lead to disaster outcomes that are effective for anybody. We have a history, not just in this country and many countries, where historically, hazard-specific organizations like a wildfire agency might want to gobble up the EMO of the world, or vice versa. There's no reflection on Manitoba. We have a great relationship with the Manitoba Wildfire Service, but that usually doesn't lead to good outcomes. Letting the hazard specialists do what they need to do and empowering them to do it, and the same for the impact specialists, that leads to good outcomes. Trying to rule the world is no good for emergency management, so it's a dish to avoid. Benign incapacity sounds like the most academic of academic phrases. Really what it means is lack of resources. So there's an inability to contribute to the EM system, but not because of any malintent, but because the resources doesn't exist. And this is very true of smaller jurisdictions. And it's something that provincial and federal governments especially need to start paying attention to for smaller jurisdictions like municipalities, like some Indigenous communities, to ensure that they have the resources and the capacity to be able to build their own EM systems, because they will do so better than the province or the federal government trying to do so. So benign incapacity is something to avoid. And one more academic phrase for everybody, conceptual difference. And really all this means is not seeing eye to eye. So when you get into the planning phase of a very complex event, like a large wildfire, flood, an earthquake, tornadoes, never mind pandemics or large security events, people are gonna have different perspectives all the time. So assume that people are thinking about things differently and try come to the same page. This isn't rocket science by any means at all. But in our world, in the emergency management world, especially when we're responding, this could be the difference between millions of dollars of property damage, lives damaged, communities impacted, evacuees out for way longer than they should be, because different organizations or different leaders didn't see eye to eye. So trying to reduce this conceptual difference as much as possible is a key thing for us to do. So the difference itself is something to avoid. Desserts, I wanted to end on a bit of a light note. The nice thing is that for those who are interested in this world or want to improve their own emergency management organizations or are just worried about the hazards of the future, the appetizers I talked about, information sharing, flexibility, collective conflict resolution, those are not super difficult to do. You can work at them now already and they'll make a difference. The hazard or threat type doesn't matter. All these ingredients of successful emergency management will lead to good outcomes regardless of the type of hazard or threat you're dealing with. And then the nice thing too is that although resources are certainly needed, especially in smaller jurisdictions, there's a lot we can do by implementing these ingredients without always waiting for the latest research or more resources. So thank you so much for your patience, everyone. I'm sorry for talking so fast and talking so much. We will have about 5 minutes for questions. I'm happy to stay a little longer if it keeps popping up, but I'd like to leave you with this. Emergency management isn't really always well understood by the public or even other areas of government. There's often not an appreciation that it's an established policy field. There's a minister responsible. There's a professionalized skill set. There's degrees. There's accreditations. Like it's an established field, and there are many events that go well, very well. Now, where you kind of see the coordination, communication, the collaboration that you'd expect from this system. However, we are seeing major pressure points emerge. We've identified many lessons learned from the pandemic. There are questions around to what degree the emergency management system had gaps, to what degree it should be more involved, less involved. But really, there's two major pressure points coming our way. Climate change is going to change the frequency and impact of bad things happening. So is the emergency management system ready for that? How do we assess our risk? How do we prepare and mitigate given the impacts of climate change? How do we measure that resiliency? These are massive questions that the EM world is only beginning to grapple with. And then finally is the capacity building challenge in the EM space. And this is, I think, true for many of you, if not all of you, regardless of which policy area you come from. But the labor constraints seem real. How do we attract and build organizations with enough people and the right kind of people and people who are engaged so that we can deal with multiple events sustainably over time? And a big part of answering that question is how do we do much better at incorporating the nonprofit sector, community organizations, and society writ large in being better prepared. If there's one thing you can take away from this presentation today is EM is okay, but look how heavy it is just in the governance space. What about everyone else out there that's a part of society that can help us be more resilient? That's our biggest challenge going into the future. So there's 4 minutes left. I try to fit a lot in. Apologize if there's a bit too much or if I spoke a bit too fast. Jasmine, can I just look at the chat myself, or do you want to? I'm happy.
Yeah,
to look
there's a couple questions there, and I can read them out to you. But you're also feel free to look at them yourself. We do have one interesting question that's pretty relevant for Manitoba. Uninterrupted power supply is crucial for winter conditions. What is our emergency management system in brief if we have to face longer power interruption in this winter condition? If you wouldn't mind answering that question, I'm actually interested in that one myself.
So real quick, just in the interest of time, there's probably two pieces there. The first one is, so Manitoba Hydro is obviously the entity responsible for that kind of continued power supply in terms of the grid. So where we have a responsibility is identifying them as a critical service provider under our legislation and asking them, what is their capacity plans? What are their continuity plans? We have done that. We are working with them on that piece. That's our responsibility. But I think part of what the question I'd be getting at, and I've identified this as a gap in the EM system, is outside of the formal grid, what do individuals and communities and families do to be prepared? Because we don't, necessarily have grant funding or great communication out on what individuals can do in terms of generators, backup power, routes out non-perishable food, that kind of like local resiliency. How we do that better, how we support that better is a gap we've identified, and we need to do better at it.
Awesome. Thank you, Johanu. I also want to apologize if you can hear my dog going crazy in the background. Tried to put her down before this, but she's awake now. There's one more question that I think could be good for the rest of the time. Do you have a playbook or cookbook for each type of possible emergency?
Yeah, we do internally. So it's called the Manitoba Emergency Plan. And because we are an all hazards entity, we do address every single hazard in there, the roles and responsibilities of each organization, communication processes, thresholds, and so on. So that is our internal playbook. Absolutely. I think what the caution that I would have both to the public and us internally, and this is a bit of a military phrase, but no plan survives contact with the enemy. So the moment the battle starts, your plan doesn't go out the window, but you have to be flexible. We've certainly seen this during COVID. So yes, we've got a playbook, but the larger events almost requires a degree of needing to recreate the world if you need to. So I guess it goes back to the point of being flexible.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. Noting we only have a minute left, and my dog going crazy. I think, yeah, we don't really have a whole lot of other questions. We do have a couple, but in the interest of time, we likely won't be able to answer any more. I appreciate everybody coming today, and thank you, Johanu, for taking the time to talk with your fellow public servants and public administration lovers and whatnot. I don't know if that's the right word, but yeah, thank you for coming and talking today. It was very, very interesting. And I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to the second part of the series, although I know it's not you giving it. So yeah, and everybody, thank you for coming today. I hope you enjoyed your lunch hour, if it was over your lunch hour, or just, a break for yourself. So thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks so much to everyone at IPAC and for those who called in. And if there are follow-up questions to Manitoba EMO, just look us up online, Manitoba EMO. We have contact information there. Send it in our way and we'll try to get an answer to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Johanu. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.